course, in Guatemala, bananas are better. Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Jill Terry Rudy's Of Course, in Guatemala, Bananas Are Better, Exotic and Familiar Eating Experiences of Mormon Missionaries. I love this article. I've been teaching it since since it first came out, basically. And what I like about this is that it takes, it just really nicely contextualizes changes in food experiences. And basically, it starts by, it begins with considering Lucy Long's idea of culinary tourism, and particularly the realms of otherness that we have with food. If you just define tourism as this intentional experiencing of otherness, with usually almost exclusively within the realm of leisure, and a relaxed exploratory intentionality of something that is different from the everyday. That's basically the tourism complex. Obviously, it implies going to a place, but it can also imply reading, restaurants in your local area, and so on. It's this notion of just doing other. And one of the things that she suggests, Lucy Long suggests, are these different continuums of otherness. One is the familiar and the exotic. So something that you have obviously a set of expectations for, a deep understanding of, and something that is, pushes beyond that, something that is not associated with your set of food expectations. And we could recognize as something as not belonging to our food system, and we frame it as such. These are all very contextual because, of course, they're dealing with an individual's sense of otherness. So the familiar and the exotic, and that's sort of one of the most obvious ones. But there are differences. There are additional ones, and one has to do with the edible and the inedible. And again, this is not a scientific concept. I mean, I'm not saying that Long isn't applying intelligence and theory to it. I'm saying that when we describe a food in this matrix as being inedible, we're not talking about rocks. We're not talking about car batteries. We're talking about something that is consumable, something that the human body can ingest. Yet, at the same time, something that I can't identify as food. Whether that is through a specific set of rules and norms and expectations, so something that is sort of culturally unclean to eat as a food. You can consider things like the rules of halal or the rules of kashrut, which identify certain things, certain potential foodstuffs as unclean and therefore not fit for consumption, where even within that system you recognize that it is edible, but it is not edible and maintaining the sacred self. It might be something along the lines of the way we categorize different animals, that insects don't fall into the realm of edible. They don't fall into the realm of food, even though we recognize that they are potentially consumable. No, one doesn't eat an insect, they are unclean. And again, this is perspectival, because you can immediately say, oh, they eat insects here. It's like, yes, and that's how we exoticize the other, and that's how we frame that as a form of otherness. We can think of particular foods, just sticking to the mammalian kingdom, sure, sticking to mammals, in that we're okay, maybe we're not, of course, because we also have rules of veganism and vegetarianism and so on, but we are conceptually okay with beef, i.e. cow. We're conceptually okay with chicken. We're conceptually okay with pork, but we are not conceptually okay with horse or with cat. Squirrel is very ambivalent. Rabbit, similarly, lamb, a lot of people are on the cusp of that, and we recognize that they are not foods. I cannot eat that. That is not something that is going into my body. So that is what is meant by the edible and the inedible. What is that? Parts of an animal, where it's like, oh, I can eat the chicken breast, but I can't eat the chicken foot, or I can't see heads or something in my food. So we have these sort of different levels of edible and inedible. And then the third is the palatable and the unpalatable. And that is sensory. That is not the conceptual in terms of the set of expectations one has for that thing, that sort of category of food. That is not about whether it is something that can go into the body, because it doesn't qualify as food, because it is outside our contextually constructed categories of what is edible and what is inedible, but something that is about the pleasing of the senses. So because you can consider something that is food, this is something that I can consume. It is exotic, but you are interested in experiencing that exoticness, and then you eat it, and it's like, I just don't like it. And the I just don't like it in a way sort of transcends those categories, because the flip side is that, oh, I do like this, even though it's not, maybe it's inedible conceptually. It's like, I'm going to try it once. Like, oh, okay. Maybe it's so exotic, but it's like, oh, I like this. But palatable, it's personal. You can't argue with that. Tastes can change. You can develop a tolerance for things like spicy. And spiciness is one of those categories that I cannot stand that food, or I cannot stand that cuisine. It is too spicy. I cannot handle it. Or, oh, they use a lot of salt or whatever. But you might slowly accommodate. Oh, it's too fatty. The international students who come here will often talk about, oh, the salty and the sweetness and the weird combination of flavors that we understand as normative. So those are three categories. And Rudy, in her article, is talking about how there are different opportunities for exploring that sense of otherness that you can frame within this category of tourism, but it's not your typical tourist expectation. It's the extended stay tourist, someone who is going to be at a place not indefinitely. It's different from, say, immigrant foodways and how they acclimate and retain their own home communities' food experiences to the best of their ability, while also adapting to new ones, with the expectation that they are fundamentally, creating new communities, new traditions in this new place. Rather, it has to do with people who are going for an extended period of time, but that time is finite. And what's more, the specifics of the time, the time that is finite, where they are, by dint of circumstance, by force, they are going to have to engage in local foodways. So different, she compares it to military bases where you might be overseas for a number of years, but you have an entire apparatus that's going to support that community that can, she's an American, and that can provide American foodways for all your meals, all your leisurely food activities, all your snacks. You don't necessarily need to engage. You can, but then you are basically being a regular tourist as opposed to the extended stay tourist. And this is different from perhaps diplomatic circles. But this is for Mormon missionaries, her particular experience, both in terms of being a professor at Brigham Young University and also from being a former missionary herself. She recognizes that food becomes this circumstance because mission work requires the circumstances of mission work, that one is basically dropped into a community with a partner that is not from, is heretofore a stranger to you. You go through training and then you go to a place that is fundamentally not of your home community. It could be within the country, but still there's going to be regional differences, or it could be halfway around the world. And you have limited contact with your home community. You have limited budget. If you might have saved up some money, you have a small stipend, but it is fairly limited circumstances, which is part of the experience. You are wearing a uniform, the white shirt, the tie, the name tag that identifies you as an elder. It identifies you as a mission. As on mission, and you are proselytizing. So at all times you are marked in the grand in the outside world as other. You are conspicuous in your otherness. So there's no sort of assimilationist possibility, because assimilation is not your goal. You are there to proselytize, to potentially convert, and so on, to help establish the church. And so you are, as you are trying to, you're trying to live. You need to eat. In all these circumstances, whenever we talk about food, we have to begin with the idea that you need to eat while you are there. Your budget is limited, your resources are limited, your access to familiar foods is going to be limited, and the more further. Sure, the further you are away from your home community, the less and less you have access to familiar foods. And you do have these twin desires. Again, the twin desires that is common. It's common through immigrant. It's common through many circumstances. And you can think students work in a very similar way. If you are a student who is not going to university in your home community, it works in very much the same way. And that you have a exploratory, willful, joyful desire to participate in this other culture. That's half of the reason that you are there. That might be much of the reason why you are there. Simultaneously, you do like the familiar. You do like to participate in those comforts that are at home. So, with her work, one of the things that she points out is that mission work is such a high context idea. Mission work is something that marks Mormon identity, because while you are in that uniform, while you are in the field, that is who you are. You might, obviously there is a lot of confluence. You are not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination, but you are likely an American. But you have a whole host of identities that you bring, and those identities are going to sort of percolate into how you interpret. But for the most part, if we think about a folk group as the two or more people who share at least one thing in common, that one thing, when that one thing is focused, when that one thing is specific, when that one thing is the reason that is being for this particular practice, for the reason for this particular gathering, that is what we might call a high context, where everything is subsumed into the idea that you are a Mormon missionary, and this is what you are doing. So all your other identities are present, but this is what you have. Conversely, at the same time, Mormons, so many, I think I would be fair to say the majority of Mormons have had this same experience. So it becomes a touchstone for conversation. It becomes a touchstone for conversation among Mormons who have returned. It becomes a touchstone for conversation among ex-Mormons, or people who have subsequently left the church if they have done so after their mission work, because it was such a moment. It is a transformative time. You can make arguments about a liminal time, a whole bunch of different fancy words for it, but so many have gone through it. And therefore, it becomes sort of a default experience. It becomes everyone's mission experience was different, but everyone went on mission. And everyone's mission, it was similar in kind, similar in the high context, that you can start to identify patterns within these stories, within the stories that they tell. And since this article came out, you have the rise of social media, you have the rise of YouTube and TikTok and memes, and now you actually have a whole host of mission lore that is digital and shared at the time. So one of the things she talks about are these initiations that people go through. That before I get to that point, I just want to say that her major insight, which on one hand, I mean, her method, that is, I think, what makes this a really interesting article. It takes it from sort of this obvious point to this wonderful point, and something that you could potentially work beyond your or evaluate in your own experience. one of the things she talks about is that because this is the high context, because these narratives emerge, we can use narrative as a way in. So it's not simply the food event. You can do ethnographic research, if you so desired, on mission food habits and mission food ways and mission food events. And conversely, or you can look at the narratives that are subsequently told, because now you have this, you have two things. Once, now you have the idea that the experience has gone through some kind of processing, and it isn't simply the immediate narrative of event, but the longer distance narrative of story. And from the perspective of someone where the event is complete, and one can start to see the big picture. One can also turn it into an aesthetic object. It is now an object in a person's personal experience narrative repertoire, and therefore it might be polished, it might be honed, it might be exaggerated, but those exaggerations are actually kind of important because they are about emphasizing the palatable and the unpalatable, the edible and the inedible, the familiar and the exotic. They take these things and they heighten them, and therefore they give us an insight into these general patterns that people might have been having. So one of the things she talks about, getting back to the video stuff, is that there's so many narratives about initiation, either a deliberate initiation where other missionaries at that moment in that host community with a little bit more experience bring the new people to a food event that they know is going to challenge their issues of palatability, issues of edibility, issues of exotic versus familiar, and like, look at this, and have someone undergo that food experience. So specifically some kind of rite of passage, some kind of initiation, whether that is deliberate and or whether that is by virtue of sorry, let me rephrase this. So you have those deliberate initiations, and you can sometimes see those on YouTube where you have someone has just whipped out their phone and is now filming the new missionary eating this thing for the first time and gauging their reactions. So it's like, ha 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 ha. So it's a very, very light hazing, but it's like, welcome to here. This is what you're going to get used to. Conversely, there are stories about initiation where at the very least it's the personal experience narrative of someone's first time encountering, often at a host family, because of the limited resources that people have. There's either cooking for themselves, which has issues, which I'll get to in a moment, or as part of the work, as part of their mission work, often being invited into the homes of local Mormons, not missions, but local Mormons, who have households and who will regularly feed them as part of their religious practice. So their idea of being sort of good Mormons is to play host to the missions and make sure that they get a good square meal every now and then, and they're the people who are going to be written home to mom and so on, and it's this lovely cycle that keeps on going. But it's the first time that you're going to your host family and you are on double good behavior. A, because you are a Mormon missionary. B, because you have a position of respect and status, and you are now trying to perform that position of respect and status. And 3, because you are an 18-year-old kid who was raised reasonably well, and that is what you do when you are on your good behavior. And then coming across a food that I cannot process, and all those narratives about how to do it, and the sort of subcategory of narrative of how to get rid of the food in an inconspicuous way, and even the failures of getting rid of the food in an inconspicuous way, where there's almost a sort of meta lesson of like, well, there's no shortcut. You just have to take your lumps. There's another section of narratives that has to do with trying to recreate the familiar, whether that is the extraordinary, well, sometimes it's not extraordinary, but sometimes it is, lengths to participate in North American foodways overseas. I know there was a friend of mine, she was not a Mormon missionary, she was teaching English in Korea, and her boyfriend never, ever acclimated to Korean food, and so they ate out whenever they ate out at American-style chain restaurants, which were ridiculously expensive and ridiculously sort of filled with fatty foods, and but almost all the economic incentive for going over to Korea and teaching English for a couple of years to pay off student loans disappeared because it was like all the money was going to restaurant food. So I mean that's a fabulat in my repertoire of my friend and her time in Korea. But just going to McDonald's, going to something that gives a taste of home, even if that taste of home is not necessarily one of the tastes that you would have when you are at home. Someone who doesn't go to McDonald's very often might go. I have another example. Oh, I'm so filled with these kind of narratives of other people's experiences where I had a friend when I was at graduate school at Memorial. She was from Seattle, and after a couple of weeks, she just started going to the Starbucks at the chapters in St. John's. Not that she ever really liked Starbucks, because I mean Starbucks was sort of the crass commercial, and she liked actual sort of genuine cafe culture. But she was finding the experience so very exotic, so very unfamiliar, that the foodways and the whole sort of and the climate and the atmosphere of St. John's, that she just needed that touchstone of familiarity, of going to a place and drinking large cups of coffee and having sort of smooth jazz or singer-songwriter music in the background. It's like, I can do this. So Mormon missions have a similar experience, and again, with limited resources. They don't have a huge amount of money kicking around, so these are major events, especially when these foods are going to be expensive in their places. And then when they recreate exotic foods, when they create familiar foods at home, and they create their North American foods at home, all of a sudden they realize that these ingredients are hard to get, that there's a strategy that's required, whether it's things like writing home and asking for a care package to be sent, or developing local networks and seeing where one can get these things, or get these things, or get equivalents to these things in order to prepare meals. And by doing so, by trying to recreate the familiar in exotic circumstances, they are recognizing that what they consider familiar is contextually familiar to their home community. So all of a sudden, they are seeing their food as exotic through the eyes of someone else, which is that lovely ethnographic proverb via Chesterton by a whole bunch of people, making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, which is also applied to art. It's applied to a whole bunch of different realms of human experience. But it is one of those things that's happening. Like all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's not normative for, I'm just trying to think of it. Look at me coming up with example after example from my own experience. Again, people who teach in Korea, because I know so many people who've gone over to Korea for a couple of years, and getting peanut butter sent to them, or Cheese Whiz, or Velveeta cheese or something. Basically food that is not available in local grocery stores. Like, I need this thing. It is not, and not only do I need this thing, when someone comes in and has this taste of home, it is like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? This is wonderful. Right. So it forces one to recognize that one's home experience is something that is not default universal, which is a shift. And if you have lived anywhere else and you're like, why can't I get this thing? Why can't I get this brand of things? It's like, oh, this brand of things isn't here. This brand of things isn't normative. It is contextually familiar. It's like, oh, okay. And then this is just extended for 18 months. Yeah. So one of the things that happens is that, and again, because these are narratively framed, these are stories that are told typically in retrospect. You can read diaries, and in fact, Rudy presents insight from her own field diaries while she was on mission. So stories are being told at the time, but a lot of these are done in retrospect because the stories have to do with change. They have to do with this process of moving from the exotic to the familiar, the familiarization of these exotic foodways. the slow accretion of recognizing these foods as moving from inedible to edible, and from unpalatable to palatable. The shift in taste, which is a transformation. It is some kind of transition. It is a rite of passage. It moves you in that way. And it moves away to the point where people's food habits are fundamentally different afterwards. And they come back to their home communities. And again, she's using Northeast Utah, Salt Lake City as the example, because that's where she is from, and she's talking to students, and she's going through student papers as illustrative points for this. But she also looks at the convenience stores that are on the campus at Brigham Young University, where they have these exotic foods available. That is, which, if you have been to universities and gone to their convenience stores, that isn't necessarily always the case. They might be slightly more cosmopolitan than a convenience store that is located elsewhere in that community, potentially. But at Brigham Young, it's conspicuous, and they are meeting the taste expectations of their students. And unlike in some universities where they're trying to meet the taste expectation of their international students, they are trying to meet the expectations of their local students who have gone through mission. And they've gone through mission, and their tastes have fundamentally changed. So it's this broad panoply. So a place that you might think of as conservative as Utah, and as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant adjacent as Utah, and nevertheless has a remarkable cosmopolitan palate because of mission, because of experiencing. And these narratives become a way of illustrating the transformation. There's a wonderful series that the church puts out, and of course the church is going to be putting out training videos for potential future missionaries, and which are often comprised of, for lack of a better word, testimonies of people returning from mission. And if you go through them, they're quite wonderful, because when they're talking about their what it is like, what life is like being there, and a lot of the time they're talking about their mission work. And they are sincere, they are ingenuous, but they are sort of performing, as it were. They're positioned from their role as the high context statist mission, and they're talking about the how good it is to spread the word, how difficult it is, how their faith gets them through, all these things which are critically important, and again, sincere. But then when they start talking about things like food, you see them break through that, and you see this sort of wash of familiarity, and they are gone from telling something testimonial to just sharing experience. And there's just this wonderful, I cannot put it into words, but you see it, and all of a sudden it moves from being an account to a reminiscence. And these are just returned missionaries. These are people who have years of honing their narratives. You just have these people who are like, yeah, well, man, the fruit. You're just not going to. You've never seen fruit like this, and they're almost staggered by it. But they want to communicate that experience in an interpersonal way, not through the status of returning, and the status and esteem that is accorded a returning missionary, but person to person. It's like, dude, you just got to do this, and all of a sudden it's like, it's wonderful. I'll link to some of those in the description and see if there's like a playlist that'll go through. Anyway, so this has been one of my favorite articles because it explores this concept of change. When we think about our foods, our traditional foods, we're basically thinking about those things that we anticipate, if not will always be there, then at least have always been there. and that is normal, and that is right, and that is every day. And sometimes it's the stuff that we recognize is distinct to our group, and sometimes it's just there, and it's only when it's put into different contexts do we realize that it is distinct to our group. And this is a story about a group This is a context in which a group specifically gets outside of the quotidian and the everyday and the familiar, and discover something, and change. And it doesn't mean that they reject their home foods, but they have expanded their heretofore limited by circumstance, limited by liberty food habits. It's a wonderful article. And the article's name again is Jill Terry Rudy's, of course, in Guatemala, bananas are better, exotic and familiar eating experiences of Mormon missionaries. My name is Ian. I wish you absolutely nothing but the best as ever. Take care, and bye-bye.